Namaste, Dandavat Pranam.
Namaste, Dandvat Pranam, Prabhu.
I'm here
Thank you
with,
for taking our time.
yes, Pradiyumna Prabhu. We're happy to be here with you discussing this book.
The privilege is mine. Thanks a lot for taking our time. Uh, Unfortunately, I couldn't join last Sunday. I think there was some timing mismatch that I had, and I somehow missed that. But I went through the recording, the reading that you did last Sunday, and it was very interesting just because of your reading. So I have read this book earlier, but when I heard when a third party, somebody reads it out loud, it resonates very differently in your mind. It works very differently when you hear it to when you read it, right?
Yes,
So this what was my first experience, and I would request probably more and more people to join this, right? Because this is very interesting for everybody when they hear it compared to when they read it. It's very different. That's my personal experience.
yes. We've also experienced that, so it's good to know that hearing it and reading it will give deeper, maybe some kind of deeper realization or something.
Yes, yes, Prabhu. So, Prabhu, when last time also, when I read the book around 2-3 months back, and similar queries came across in my mind when I went through your recording last Sunday. I think it was last Sunday. However, there are certain points which got cleared as you were reading it out, but I would like to just highlight, uh, because Puri Maharaj uh, uh, i- is taking this the drift of the book. Is very important that the reader should get the drift of the book. Okay, in order to get the drift of the book, um, I had probably written down certain questions which will also drive curiosity in the minds of readers and followers. Now I had a very specific question right now. When the author says, so I'll read my questions as as a a first party. You're a second party, and the author is a third party.
Okay.
Yeah. So as a first party, my question, which was resonating in my mind and which we can discuss in here is, when the author says in the start of the logic of life chapter, the author says that the modern science applies same logic to mechanical, chemical, and biological entities. That's where the base of the chapter starts from,
Yes,
right? So there could be a very good, maybe we can discuss as a precursor. Why does the author says that the modern science applies the same logic?
sure. So, like you said, the main part of the chapter is these distinctions between the three systems, but he gives a little bit of context before he mentions that. The idea is to rationally distinguish between life and non-life. So in the beginning of the chapter, Sripad Bhaktimadhava Puri Maharaj describes the characteristics of animate objects and inanimate objects, where inanimate objects have no capacity to move or basically to move or to have any activity unless something external to it acts upon it. So a ball is an inanimate object. It will move, but only if somebody throws it or pushes it. A rock, same thing. Any inert matter, again, has that same quality. Now, animate objects are objects, living objects, that can move from some internal impetus. So we have an ant, right? An ant is moving because it has some desire to survive. It needs to feed itself, it needs to reproduce. So it's moving because it has some internal drive. And we find this in any organisms and also in cells, right? Cells are the smallest living object. So this is some very clear precursor between life and non-life that then building upon the details of that difference and the logic that applies to those different systems now comes in the form of mechanical, chemical, and teleological or biological systems.
So when you say this statement, Prabhu, it means that you're trying to say relative movement externally viewable to the masses is what you're trying to say, a difference between an animate and inanimate object.
It's in external versus internal is the difference, right? Things which only rely on other mass externally interacting with it to move, those things are not alive. There's no
Yeah.
internal drive.
Okay. Okay. I would, slightly probe again on this question further.
Yes.
One is the inanimate, one is the discussion about animate and inanimate object, which I fairly get it, right? I would again go back to my question for probably clarification, or maybe I'm not getting it with my imbecile mind. So please pardon me for repeating this question. When when you say the modern science applies the same logic to
I see.
see when you say that it applies the same logic, are you trying to say that it applies the same logic to animate and inanimate things?
Yes, that's right. So
Right.
thank you for clarifying the question again. I can now address it more
And there's a
directly.
difference between, yeah, mechanical, chemical, and biological entities. Now, there could be a mechanical entity which is a living entity, or a chemical reaction happening in a living entity, or an animate object could also have any of these two characteristics of mechanical and chemical, right?
So modern science, what Maharaj said was, modern science does not distinguish the different logics that apply to mechanical system, chemical system, and a biological system. They think that biological system is the same as a mechanical system. Same logic applies. A clock,
Okay.
a clock
Hmm.
is a mechanical system, and then a dog is also a mechanical system, just more complicated. That's what they say.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification, Prabhu. I would move to my next question. Um, uh, Now, what is the difference between energia or actuality and actualizing force, which is
Mm.
also called as entelechy or entelechy, right? So one is energia and one is entelechy.
Yes.
So what's the difference between, yeah?
So when we talk of energia, these are the terms Aristotle gave, right? About
Yes.
2,000 years ago, more, almost 3,000 years ago. So,
Yes.
and they're still relevant to our study of nature. So energia means actuality, the active, what a thing is, a tree. A tree is actively a tree, but that's in contrast to the dunamis, the potential of the tree when it's still a seed, right? A seed is a tree, but not yet. It has the potential to become the tree. Once it's a tree, once it's actually a tree, now we're talking about energia. It's matured. It's matured. The potential which it used to have, now it's mature. Okay, so now between dunamis, the potentiality, and energia, the actuality, again, the seed and the tree, what is it that unfolds, what is it that drives that potential to then become a mature tree? What is it that drives the immature to mature? What is that? So this is what Aristotle called entelechy. Now, these are all Greek, these are Greek terms, and entelechy has a word, very important word inside of it, is telos. Entelechy is telos inside of it. Telos means purpose, or the final end. So what is driving the potential to actualize is the purpose that it fulfills as its maturity.
Okay. So now this theory of energia, and dunamis, and from moving from a immature stage to a mature stage.
Yes.
Right. When we cite an example of a seed and a plant, and the force that's driving it is entelechia or the entelechy, right? The actualizing force, right?
Yes.
Now, why wouldn't a materialistic scientist also quote this by picking it up and saying that, okay, from some smaller things, I'm able to build some larger things, right?
Sure.
Right? I can quote that as a material scientist, right?
Material scientists are saying it's all just physical stuff. The seed turning into a tree is just interaction of physical things engaging with each other and producing reaction, engaging with each other, producing more reaction. It's all physical. That's what the materialistic scientists are saying.
Yeah. So my question was, probably I didn't quote my question properly. Further probing into what I asked earlier, which, while thanks for explaining the first part of the question. So I got the difference between actuality, energy, and dynamis, and the actualizing force. That's, brings it to the mature stage. I think the audience also would have got it by now. But so what does it also mean that I can apply this particular principle or this particular concept in, let's say, uh, I get some engine parts, okay, I get some gears, uh, and I start building on it, and I give it a form of a car or a bike or some, mechanical instrument, right? So can I also apply this concept that I'm the actualizing force behind building that spares into an engine or building that spares into a car?
Yes, of course. So then we have to recognize what is being said, right? The organism, the seed, is turning into the tree by its own process. We're not seeing something outside of the seed acting on the seed to make it into a tree. In the case of a car, we're seeing some external agent coming to build the car, taking it from just parts into the whole. Now, an organism, that process is happening of its own accord. And it's also been able to reproduce itself into another thing, another organism that has the same experience. But with cars, we're not seeing the parts come together by itself, and we're not seeing one car make another car. It's all completely dependent on external agency coming together and doing it. But that is completely different than what's happening with the organism.
Okay, thanks a lot. I got my answer. So, in this concept, it's important to note that for all of us that the actualizing force is intrinsic in the energia to grow into a dynamis or a more mature stage.
It's intrinsic to the organism.
Yeah.
So when we're talking in these terms, it's a holistic idea. So the intrinsic actualization is within the whole itself. The potential is one aspect of the whole. The mature part is another aspect of the whole. And the intrinsic potency that is manifesting it to become the mature stage is also intrinsic. These are all aspects of a whole that can't be taken apart because, again, we take the organism. You want to know what physical thing inside the seed turns it into a tree? Okay, you take the seed apart. What happens? Now you have a dead seed that won't grow.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can't, when you want to see what makes the embryo turn into the mature baby or and then further organism, you can't take it apart to find the thing and then put it back together. Life doesn't work like that. Once you take it apart, that life is no longer the same. You could put it back together, but it will just be a dead body, essentially. So it's a whole different way of thinking when we're approaching the mechanical system, where you can take things apart, put them back together, and it's the same clock. But it does not apply to organisms.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for explaining. I think things are much more clearer now.
Sure.
And now my third question, I'll put in my third question. What does it mean, the organic unity of different moments or paths that constitutes its content? So this is particularly, just give me a moment, please.
Sure.
So I was trying to identify this sentence as a where it came from the precursor, but yeah. So
Let's see. It is the unity. It's on page 18 or 19, I believe. Yes, the last paragraph on page 19, I think. Life is a unity.
No, that's biological systems. I don't think so. It will be on page number 19. It should be, I think, it should be before the mechanical objects. I'm sorry, I'm just taking time because I just have this.
Yeah.
Uh,
Can you read the sentence again? I'll try to find it in the book here.
yeah, because I forgot to mark it. I usually mark it. I have marked everything, but I wrote this line, but I forgot to mark it in the book. So I'll repeat it. What does it mean? Organic unity of different movements or parts that constitutes its content.
Uh, yes. Okay. It's on page 15, the paragraph right before mechanical object section.
Yeah, I'm on page 15.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's the second to last sentence in that paragraph right before mechanical object.
I got it. The concept for Hegel is essentially a dynamic or organic unity of the different moments or part that constitutes. Yeah, this one. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there are a lot of variables in this sentence, right?
Mm.
So because I really want to, because what this states, this particular sentence is, uh, I'm talking about now, not the concept as a verbatim use, but as a concept of what Hegel calls it the concept, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So the concept for Hegel is that essentially a dynamic or organic unity of the different moments or parts that constitutes its content. So, so I'm getting lost in this.
Okay. So for Hegel, the concept is a part of his logic. In Hegel's systematic philosophy, the necessary development of the absolute starts in logic, develops through nature, and concludes in spirit. So we start logic through nature into spirit. Logic means what are the thought determinations that underlie anything in nature that we sensuously experience, or even things that we don't experience in nature. Just like we'd be able to distinguish when we look at an apple, there are three things going on. The apple in front of us that we can hold, the individual specimen. But then we're saying apple. All apples in the world are being referred to when we say apple. It's what distinguishes the concept of apple from an orange or a pear. So we say apple and we mean the specimen in our hand, but what we're actually referring to is this species that's more of an idea that we can't actually refer to without being universal, right? We say apple and we mean what's in our hand, but we're actually saying something which means many apples. We say apple, it means any apple. And then farther, we have the idea of fruit, right? The apple is a fruit. That's the universal. So we have these three moments of the concept, what Hegel calls the concept: universal, particular, individual. So we have one apple, and Hegel says that the concept of anything has these three parts: universal, particular, and individual. And you have to have some awareness or knowledge of these three aspects, universal, particular, and individual, in order to have a complete idea of the concept of anything, of any one thing. So when Hegel uses the word concept, it's comprehensive, it's a complete idea. It's not just some abstract thing opposed from a context. It's the thing in the context, right? It's not just the apple as if the apple doesn't exist within a context that affects what the apple is, right? Many times people think of a concept, it means they isolate this thing out of the context that it's a part of. And they just think about this one thing as if it exists in isolation. But nothing exists in isolation. Everything exists within a context. And the identity of the individual thing that we're trying to think about necessarily relates to other things in the context. And unless we consider those contextual relationships and their impact or effect on the individual thing that we're thinking about, we won't have a full or complete idea of anything. So when modern scientists approach nature with this idea of reducing everything to atomic constituents, isolating everything from the context in which they find it, and then try to build knowledge from the ground up based on this mental abstraction of atomic parts, then it's just constructing something in the mind and then applying that to reality, because they have forgotten the context which they originally found any phenomena in. That fact is what led scientists like Werner Heisenberg, who is a pioneering father of quantum mechanics, to say that our science is not a body of knowledge of nature as it is. It's about what we can say about nature. It has more to do with our thoughts about nature rather than nature in itself. Because it's not contextual. We need to be more contextual in our understanding. And what Hegel uses the word concept, what he's developed is a systematic way, not that he developed it, it's actually the way thought develops of its own accord, so that we can contextualize everything and not just isolate things. Is that helpful? I don't know.
Yeah. So I think it's more discussive, this question, than understanding or creating a rationale behind it.
Okay.
So one is the apple is there, right? And if you ask Apple, what are you? It's not going to say that I'm Apple, because that's what I have defined Apple to be. Or for example, when my father would have named me Pradyum, or my grandfather named me Pradyum, right? But because he identified me as Pradyum, probably the whole world is identifying me as Pradyum. That's what the government paper says. That's what Pradyum is all about. Now, let's presume that I never knew my name is Pradyum. Everybody else knew that my name is Pradyum. Just like in the case of Apple. Everybody knows it's an apple. You call it an apple. I call it an apple. We all call it an apple. But Apple doesn't know that it's being called as an apple, right? So it doesn't have any identity. Okay. So for example, let's come back to Pradyum as an example. For me, it's I'm trying to see Pradyum from the perspective of the people who have identified me. Which in this case, for example, let's say I'm talking to you or to my, or to any other person in this world. They know me that my name is Pradyum, but that's what they identify me. Okay. But if you ask me, okay, if you ask me, what am I need to have a very deeper understanding about who am I, what am I at the end of the day, because it's the perspective. What I'm trying to drive in here, what's my drift of the comment in here is, probably
about the concept, though. Your question was about what Hegel means about the concept, right?
Yes. So when we were discussing about, again, I repeat that line, the concept for Hegel is essentially a dynamic or an organic unity of the different movements of parts that constitutes its content.
So the dynamic unity.
There are different thought process. No, there's a different thought process too now. For example, let's say we pick your example of Apple, right? And if I try to talk to Apple that, okay, you know what, Apple, think, essentially you are an organic unity of different moments of part that constitutes your content.
Okay.
You getting my point?
So
I don't know if I'm able to.
Well, I think there's some gap here in what's being said. So when we're saying the concept of an external object in the environment, right? I'm some entity, subjective. I have some subjective consciousness. I'm a subject, and then there's some object, which is object means it's not me. Object is I'm the subject, and there's some object external to me. That external
Correct.
object is an apple.
Yes.
Now, the relationship between myself, the subject, and the external object, in this case, an apple, the relationship between subject and object, that's what consciousness is. There's some object external to me, but I'm able to take that object and inside of my own consciousness and now think about it. When I become my own, so no, that's one case. But now if I start thinking about myself, I'm the subject, and I take my own self to be the object of my thought, that's different from consciousness. Now that's self-consciousness. So that's a different, now we're talking about a different level.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I think I got diverted a bit. Again, sorry, I'm going to pester again on this sentence, okay, on this line for some more time. Okay.
Yeah.
Please be patient with me, okay?
Yeah.
See, I'm trying to fit this line with some kind of a example or a illustration. Okay? To understand this line, can we cite some example to understand this line? Let me put it this way. For example, again, I repeat, the concept for Hegel is essentially a dynamic or an organic unity. Can you give me an example what you mean by a dynamic or organic unity of the different movements or parts? Now, can you give me an example of different movements and parts which unites together to make this dynamic organic unity that constitutes its content? Now, what's this content? Because the parts itself are the contents according to me.
Yeah, so when we say the concept of something, we ask, what is the concept of a bird? We're inquiring about the concept. We want to have some comprehensive or complete knowledge of this thing called a bird. Now, the content means, what is the practical knowledge? What is that knowledge? That is the content of the concept. We're inquiring about the concept, but we don't know it yet. That knowledge is the content. And now, so now that content will take the form that knowledge takes a very specific form of very determinate details of the concept of a bird, which distinguishes the bird from a fish or from a tree. The content of the concept of a bird is different than the content of the concept of a fish. And so what Hegel says is that in order to think about that very distinct concept of the bird, we need to think about three aspects of the bird. We need to think about the universal aspect of the bird, the particular aspect of the bird, and the individual aspect of the bird. So this is like the system that he has described about how to approach a complete knowledge, and complete knowledge means the concept. So in order to know the concept of the bird, to have a complete knowledge of the bird, we need to consider the universal aspect, the particular aspect, and the individual aspect. So this is the framework. And now the more determinate details that we're looking for will come into this framework.
Sure. So let's say that, I got this. Thanks a lot, Prabhu. This is really helpful. Now, we'll try to slightly expand this conversation of, the universal aspect, the particular aspect, and the individual aspect to understand the bird. So basically, when you say aspect, it's a perspective, right? It's a perspective. When it's a universal perspective to understanding a bird, there is a particular perspective to understanding a bird, right? And there is an individual perspective to understanding a bird. What we are doing right now is an individual perspective to understand the bird.
But it's not just a perspective where it's some external agent looking at the bird from these three perspectives. It's an aspect of the thing itself, of the bird itself. So we're saying the bird itself has these three aspects: universal, particular, and individual. So I'm saying it's not just our perspective, and then we're saying, okay, let's look at it from these three different angles. We're saying the thing itself, the bird itself, has these three aspects intrinsically a part of its comprehensive concept.
Understood. I think it's much more clear. So I'll just repeat, so the bird to know the bird to know itself, the thing in itself, uh, it needs to have a universal aspect of its existence or its identity. It also needs to understand its particular uh, aspect for the existence in a particular, ambience, or probably a particular use case or isolated use case. And there's an individual aspect to the bird itself that the bird would have.
Yes.
Right. And so this obviously applies to, we can apply this to any logical being like me as well, that I would have a universal, I'm a thing in itself. Okay. When we talk about, I would have a universal aspect to myself.
Yes.
Right. And there's a particular aspect to myself, and there's an individual aspect to myself. These all constitute, actually, all put together. This is what, this is all the unity of all this, is the concept, is what you're trying to say.
Exactly.
Am I correct?
You're correct. And now the reason that this comes before in the book, this comes before then getting into mechanical, chemical, and teleological, is because, so this is the framework of conceptual thinking that now we can apply to these three different systems that we find in nature. So it gives some structure for then approaching how we can think about it. And now we're applying it to mechanical systems, chemical systems, and biological systems.
Clear. Understood. This concept now we're going to apply to mechanical, chemical, and biological systems. Perfect. Yes. Perfect. I think this was really helpful, Prabhu. So these were, I think, more of the questions that I had. Probably I'll have, more on. I think for here onwards, everything else gets connected, because I understood now the content written in the mechanical objects or the chemical objects or the biological systems. So I get the drift now about it.
So,
yeah.
And this is also will be helpful for our discussion tomorrow. We're hoping that some of the participants in the group will come and join us tomorrow. We have put the time in the group, and this way we can continue with why these ideas are relevant, and getting just clearer idea of what's being said, so that we can move on, like you're saying, to the next part of the book, where we're catching the drift, and now we're able to follow the development a bit easier.
Yes. Yes, Prabhu. Yes. Thanks a lot, Prabhu. Jai.
Hare Krishna. Dandavat pranam.
Hare Krishna. Dandavat pranam. Dandavat pranam.
Just briefly say, Om Janati Midin Hasya Gyananjana Salakaya Chakshor and Militam Yena Tasma Shri Guru Vedaman. Vanchakalpa Tribhascha Kripa Sindhu Bevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namo.
Haribol.
Namaste, Dandavat Pranam. We are here today to discuss the first chapter of Idols of the Mind versus True Reality by Sripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj, the serving director of this Bhaktivedanta Institute of Spiritual Culture and Science based out of Princeton, New Jersey in the USA. Logic of Life is the first chapter of the book, which we read last Sunday. And now today we're going to discuss it. So we look forward to discussing with all the participants here today, all the devotees and other participants that may join. We're live streaming in the Facebook group, and the information to join the meeting was included in that post. So you're more than welcome to join us throughout the course of this next hour or so. So Devahuti Didi, you're asking what was being discussed yesterday during the Sangha about the book?
Everything I could follow little, but only thing is Amir Sindhu Das Prabhu's opinion on Maharaja. I could not understand everything because he was a little fast.
The main thing that Maharaj was talking about yesterday during the Sangha was the principle of Sharanagati, which is mainly with the book Prapannajivanamrita. But those kind of devotional processes are much higher development than what the first chapter of this book is dealing with. This book so far in the beginning is more just about what we are observing in nature, and then towards the end of the book is when it gets to more devotional topics. So for the purpose of our group study of this first chapter, I think it's better to just try to discuss the concepts that were discussed there. So has anyone had the chance to see any of the reading that we had or look through the first chapter of the book? We also had a meeting with Pradyumna Prabhu yesterday for about 30 minutes discussing some things. I'm not sure if anyone had the opportunity to go through that. If not, then what we can do is we'll play a video, and then we can, it's about 17-minute video. And then as that video is playing, please, write down any points that come up. It's all about the first chapter. Please write down any points that come up that you'd like to discuss. And then after the video is done, we can discuss. Can you all see the video?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Namaste. What's the difference between a rolling marble and a walking ant? How about between a ball being thrown up and the release of a bird? Well, without the influence of an outside force, the marble and ball are inert. They won't move. An ant and a bird, however, have the potential to move even without the agency of an external influence. When a marble rolls downhill, it usually stops when encountered by an obstacle, yet an ant usually goes around the obstacle. A ball tossed up usually comes down, and when thrown, the place where it will land can be precisely predicted by physics and mathematics. Yet, a bird may not always come back to the hand that released it, and its movements or destination cannot be exactly predicted. Soberly inquiring into the reasons underlying such phenomena, and systematically arriving at rational conclusions that help us better comprehend the reality in which we live, are paramount for an honest and comprehensive account of true reality. Such topics are of interest to individuals who desire to know and live in accordance with the truth. Considering the deep insights of ancient wisdom and their modern development will prove helpful in this effort. Things that solely rely on external causes to become active are inanimate objects, while things that can become active through internal causes are animate objects. This is one of the essential distinctions differentiating non-life or matter from life. In this regard, Aristotle laid the foundation for a comprehensive science of nature. In addition to the four causes that must be considered for a complete account of nature, Aristotle distinguished between the Greek terms dunamis, energia, and entelechy, or potentiality, actuality, and actualization, respectively. It is important to note that the word entelechy includes telos within it, meaning end or purpose. To initially become familiar with these ideas, we may tend to think in modern scientific terms of potential energy, kinetic energy, and the impetus that triggers the potential to actualize. But properly considering the significance of these concepts in relation to animate living objects and inanimate material objects, it's necessary to learn G.W.F. Hegel's differentiation between inner and outer teleology, as well as the distinction between mechanical, chemical, and teleological systems. In Idols of the Mind versus True Reality, Dr. Bhaktimadhava Puri explains the following. Objects that lack internal relatedness may possess merely external relatedness. Mechanics views a system as having separable independent parts that possess a fixed identity outside their connection within the system of which they are parts. If the isolated parts of a system retain the same identity as when connected within it, it is called a mechanical system. Examples of mechanical systems include the solar system or a clock. Dr. Puri goes on to say, chemical objects have parts that are internally related. They are not the same when isolated from each other as when they are connected or united with each other. External relations are formed due to the intrinsic properties of the individual parts of a chemical reaction. An example is the relationship between sodium hydroxide, hydrochloric acid, and their neutral product, sodium chloride, or table salt. Here, the individual character of a chemical object, such as being basic or acidic, is relative to the characteristic of what it is being compared to. The individual character of a mechanical object is generally not relative to external things. A gear is still the same gear whether it's in the clock or not. The relationship of mechanical objects to other objects within a mechanical system is created by external law, whereas the relationship of chemical objects to other objects within a chemical system is due to the inherent nature of each individual chemical object and the natural interaction of such objects based on these properties. So, the parts of a clock retain the same identity whether or not they are united as a clock, but the identity of chemical objects changes based upon what they are in contact with. When the neutral sodium atom encounters the negatively charged chlorine atom, they become neutral table salt. As will be seen, the so-called parts of a teleological or biological system have no substantial identity outside of their relation to the whole of which they are part. Now, let's return to Aristotle's natural philosophy and recall dunamis or potentiality, energia or actuality, and entelechy or actualization. The potential of matter is to become one, i.e., to join with other units of matter. In its potentiality, a clock exists as a formal cause or blueprint, an idea inspired by some lacking or need, which is the final cause or purpose that the clock is meant to serve. The actual clock is the product of an efficient cause, the clockmaker, working on some material cause, such as wood and metal, to form them in accordance with the blueprint. When we understand entelechy or actualization to be the work of some agency or efficient cause, the impetus that compels the potential to actualize, then we must acknowledge that mechanical systems composed of inanimate material objects completely rely on external agency to form. On the other hand, the potential of life is to become a mature form. The potential for an organism exists within the seed, which develops into the organism that then contains more seeds. A goal-directed process is observed throughout embryological development, where external attempts to interfere with or modify this process have been shown to be ineffective. Thus, it is reasonable to conclude that there is an internal agency directing the development of an animate living object towards its mature form. Immanuel Kant reached such a conclusion and called this internal agency Naturzweck in German, while Aristotle called it the soul or de anima in Greek. Hegel's systematic development of Begriff, or the concept, and its role in determining its content is extremely relevant for a scientific approach considering these matters. We may wonder, what does animate living objects? Isn't it chemical reactions? Well, chemical reactions generally produce stable products. However, these reactions are not self-perpetuating over the course of many years. Within living entities, there exist special kinds of chemical reactions that are sustained for great lengths of time. This is known as biological activity, which can become very intricate and thus defy explanation at a merely chemical level. Dr. B.M. Puri describes that those parts that cannot be separated from a system without destroying it as a working system can no longer be called parts, but are participants or members of a dynamic whole. The participants are as essential to the whole as the whole is to the participants. This is the biological system or organism. Here we are removed from the stasis of fixed objects and are in the milieu of a pure dynamical activity. Participants cannot be isolated from the whole in which they are participants and remain what they are. A DNA molecule can no more be what it is as a producer of protein molecules than the protein molecules can be what they are as produced from the action of DNA and producing the DNA. Each participant is the cause and effect of each other participant, as Kant defined organism. Therefore, nothing in an organism is without purpose, nor is the organism as a whole without purpose. In the environment, thus everything in the organism is both purpose or end, and means. The phenomena in biological systems, like the circular or dialectic relationship between DNA and protein, require conceptual thinking to be described honestly and comprehensively. Although such thinking goes against the central dogma of molecular biology, which is a theory stating that genetic information flows only in one direction, from DNA to RNA to protein, or RNA directly to protein. The dilemma which necessitates different thinking has been acknowledged by chemists like Robert Shapiro. He says, genes and enzymes are linked together in a living cell, two interlocked systems, each supporting the other. It is difficult to see how either could manage alone. Yet, if we are to avoid invoking either a creator or a very large improbability, we must accept that one occurred before the other in the origin of life. But which one was it? Dr. Leslie Ann Prey has described this phenomenon further, for those who would like to read more about the details. Encouraging us to adopt a more conceptual approach in our thinking, Dr. Bhaktimadhava Puri explains,
abstract understanding tends to think of either a unity or a multiplicity. Pure multiplicity is indicative of the atomic thinking of material reductionism. Pure unity is the indeterminateness of abstract monism. Unity in multiplicity is the comprehensive thinking of dialectical reason. Life must be comprehended as a process in which its participants are simultaneously both ends or products, and means or production to one another.
The role that thought plays in determining our observation of nature and experience of reality, including underlying conscious or unconscious presumptions, will be addressed further in our study of the second chapter of Idols of the Mind versus True Reality. Studying the distinctions between mechanical, chemical, and teleological systems correspond to the traditional disciplines of natural sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, respectively. The fields of physics and mathematics are fit to deal with mechanical systems, and chemistry is equipped to understand chemical systems. However, neither is sufficient to properly comprehend the dynamic organic nature of biological systems. We humbly recommend reading pages 101 through 107 of pioneering quantum physicist Werner Heisenberg's 1958 book, Physics and Philosophy, for a reasonable and insightful explanation which is still relevant today, briefly describing the historical relationship of classical Newtonian physics and the developing field of chemistry, and their eventual integration in quantum physics, and the rationale behind why considering this clarifies why contemporary physics and chemistry will not suffice for completely describing biological phenomena. The dynamic activity and dialectic relationships observed within living entities, from cells to organisms, throughout their developing and mature forms, is motivated by goal-directed internal agency that demonstrates resiliency against external interference. Contemporary embryonic stem cell research supports this. Soberly studying this organic activity requires interdisciplinary, cooperative, and holistic approaches throughout the subdisciplines of biology. Scientific work in cognitive biology at the cellular level is a current and widely developed field not known to many biologists and scientists in general, especially those invested in study of mechanistic concepts of natural science. Review articles on 21st century frontier science on cognitive cell biology are useful in this regard. One of the easiest and most instructive experiments anyone can do without much cost is to look under a microscope at single-celled creatures and watch the non-random, purposeful, intentional trajectory of organic cells versus the Brownian movement of dust particles. The difference between life and non-life is striking.
Subdisciplines within biology observe the cognitive activity of living entities from different angles of vision. Molecular biology is concerned with genome editing and replicating behaviors, which imply intelligent manipulation, as well as chaperone molecules appearing just when they are needed in just the right place. Cellular biology observes the ingenuity of cellular feeding behaviors, cells healing themselves, and overcoming unexpected obstacles in novel ways. Organismic biology emphasizes the role of the organism as an irreducible organic whole, within which cells, molecules, and their activities are sublated. Plant pathologist Heinrich Anton de Bary acknowledged that it is not so much that the cells make the plant, it is rather that the plant makes the cells. Organismic biologists argue against the emphasis of cells causing the organism on the basis that if cells are taken out of the organism, they will not necessarily form a new organism. Emphasis on the cell misses the role of the organism as a whole.
Again, the significance that our own thinking holds in determining how we perceive nature and reality, including our underlying metaphysical, ontological, and epistemological presumptions, will be discussed in our study of the second chapter of Idols of the Mind versus True Reality by Dr. Bhakti Madhavapuri. We hope that you will join us. Satyameva Jayate, Shri Shri Guru Gauranga Jayate.
धन्यवाद राम उमदेवी दासी प्रद्युम्न प्रभु
धन्यवाद प्रणाम प्रभु जी
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Krishna Kesala.
Sure. So any points that anybody, would like to clarify or discuss further from that?
May I bring up a point, please?
Sure.
the notion there of how, like, it starts when we talk about conceptual thinking, and then we go to the understanding of DNA messengers and the coexistence of the protein and the DNA being, how should I say, co-dependent. And the functioning of one is dependent on the other. And in so saying, if the DNA are messengers, more or less, within any living entity, and in the DNA at a very, very basic embryonic level, the DNA provides the information which allows the cellular structure of the living entity to diversify into its various component parts, such as certain cells develop a heart, certain cells develop a brain, certain cells develop, all through the instructions that are contained within the DNA structure of that living entity. Am I correct so far? Would you go along with what I'm saying so far?
Well, I mean, what you're saying sounds okay, but the point that we made in this chapter of the book, the point that Maharaj made was just simply that the relationship between the DNA and the protein, as you correctly said, is codependent. And because it's a codependent relationship, it's an example of the logic of the organism, where each of the parts is not just having an identity for itself, which is the case with mechanical systems. A gear is a gear, whether or not it's paired with another gear inside a clock. It's the same thing outside or inside the clock. But the DNA and the protein, they only exist within the organism, and they only exist from three aspects. They exist for the organism as a whole. They exist in themselves as DNA or protein, and then they also exist for the other parts of the organism, where DNA and protein have to come about simultaneously, the DNA causing the protein and the protein causing the DNA. So in this case, in the first chapter of the book, we're just simply pointing out that that circular or dialectic relationship between the DNA and the protein is an example of the interconnected nature of the logic of the organism, which is very different and distinct from the logic of both mechanical systems and also chemical systems. And the reason that it's important to think about these things, especially as individuals who are interested in spiritual development, is because in the social context that we find ourselves in, the idea of artificial intelligence being beyond the natural intelligence of a person, or the idea that a robot could replace a person, or the idea that an organism is a mechanical system just like a clock is, only an organism is more complex, but still it's a mechanical system. All these ideas are just demonstrations of a lack of understanding of what is the actual difference between life and non-life. And that has to be very thoroughly comprehended first, before then we can get to the spiritual distinction between the human form of life and the other forms of life, which is very important in the Vedic knowledge, and also in Hegel's philosophy. The human form of life is the form of life which is very different, where we can now ask about why we are suffering. Right? Throughout all animal life, suffering is there, just fighting or playing or mating or sleeping or just going through these activities. Humans also do that, but there's an added capacity where we can reflect on why are we doing these things and what is the purpose of our life. And that capacity isn't there in the other animals. So, and that question of what is the purpose of life, who are we, what are we supposed to be doing, who is God, or what is God, these important questions can only be thoughtfully approached after we clearly understand the difference between life and non-life, or mechanical systems and biological systems. So it's important from that point of view. And also we're trying to present to the scientists themselves who maybe have not come to the point where they're interested in any kind of spiritual development, but still they're not able to distinguish between the mechanical system and biological system. It's very important to be able to do that, even if our goal is just to have knowledge, true knowledge about nature, still is necessary. So it's important.
I guess my question is, how can they not see that there's a huge difference between mechanical and biological and chemical? It's very obvious to me, and I'm not a brilliant scientist.
Yeah, so that's actually, so Sripad Puri Maharaj's approach to all this is to be very well informed in both the philosophy of science and then the development of the history of ideas. What is the historical development that has taken place to get to where we are in the modern way of thinking? And so beyond this book, many of his other writings tell us about that. So briefly, it gets to answer your question, it gets to what are the presumptions, the underlying presumptions that shape modern scientific thinking, and then how they came to be, that's the historical part. But what are those presumptions? What are those axioms that are just assumed to be true? So now we can go about our scientific investigation, having these base assumptions assumed to be true that can't be proven through empirical, sensuous experience. They're just assumed, such as, contradiction means there's something wrong. If we come across a contradiction, like protein and DNA cause each other, that's a contradiction. How can we explain that in an analytical way? We can't. So then we're just going to say that DNA comes first and protein comes after that. That's what the central dogma in that video is saying. One comes before the other, period, end of statement. If you're trying to say that they come from each other at the same time, that's contradictory, so it must be false. We reject that. That's one of the presumptions. A contradiction can't exist, called the law of contradiction. Another one is the law of identity. That will be discussed more in the next chapter that Maharaj points out. The law of identity is that things are exactly what they are and not what they are not. So we see the clarity of what that means, where the identity of the whole organism is dependent on its environmental context. So if we try to just say the squirrel is just a squirrel and it's not the environment, that's the law of identity, right? The squirrel equals the squirrel. It's not the environment or anything in the environment. It's just the squirrel. But that's not the truth, right? The squirrel deeply relies on everything in the environment to be what it is. And if without that integrated relationship, the squirrel wouldn't be what it is. So if we try to think about it only in an isolated way, we're not going to get true knowledge. We're going to get some very abstract, removed, isolated knowledge. And that's his reductionism, this atomic thinking. That's what it leads to, at least. So now we just took the squirrel out of the natural environment. Now we're going to do that even further. The problem compounds. Now we're going to take the squirrel apart and see, what the cells are doing. And then we're going to see what the atoms inside the cells are doing. And we're going to come up with knowledge about these isolated parts. The knowledge that we have is just going to be about the isolated parts. And we're going to forget about the context which we found that part in. We're going to forget about that. And we're just going to have this knowledge about the part. And then we're going to, once we have all the different knowledge about all the different parts, then we're going to reconstruct the whole thing based on the knowledge, the abstract knowledge that we have. Now we're going to reconstruct the whole thing. Now we're going to tell you that the cell is something material, made of atoms and molecules only, randomly bumping into each other. And now we're going to tell you that when you put those random mechanical cells together, you get a little robot that we call a squirrel. It's a little machine. And this little robot squirrel is competing with other robots in some dead environment that is only material. And there's no purpose in life. And the universe has come from an accident. And, you know, have a great day. You know, so it's completely just, Maharaj points out in many of the writings, scientists have somehow thought themselves to become construction workers instead of trying to actually know the reality which they're a part of. Instead of trying to realize what they're a part of, they're just constructing it.
That was a
And
great analogy, by the way. The squirrel.
so, but hopefully it's clear.
Yeah, that definitely made it clear. Yeah. Thank you.
So one thing I wanted to show was if you Google if you Google origin of life, you just type in origin of life on Google, the answer that Google gives you is abiogenesis.
Oh, I see.
And it says the description of abiogenesis is, in biology, abiogenesis, or the origin of life, is the natural process by which life has arisen from non-living matter, such as simple organic compounds. So, of course, this is not anything that has been proven by scientific experiments. This is just a bias that has been embraced by the masses, definitely. So if our standard for truth is mass opinion, then it would be true. But if we go by a different standard, you know, it's very crazy that, you know, this kind of thing is shown to be the norm. So it's important, even if these kind of thoughts are difficult to grapple with, it's important to try to engage with them. So that's the point of this book study. Sripad Puri Maharaj has given, you know, everything about how to approach these problems from many different angles of vision. And of course, based in the Vedantic wisdom, what we find there, how to approach knowing true reality. And we find the parallel in the West there with Hegel's philosophy. That's why we say that it's non-sectarian, because it's not just some, you know, some thoughts or knowledge that is bracketed and rejects everything else because it doesn't coincide with some finite body of knowledge. It's something that gives a way to know everything in a very comprehensive manner. And it's something that has developed both in the East and the West without being directly connected to each other historically. So the fact that this kind of approach is a natural development of deep thinkers and sincere and humble individuals shows that it's a natural progression to come to know reality. And so what that is inquiring about spirit. All right, this is getting away a little bit about from the first chapter of the book, but in the Vedantic tradition, this is just giving some context. The Vedantic tradition starts with Vedanta Sutra, and the first verse of that is Atato Brahma Jigyasa, now inquire about spirit. In Hegel's philosophy, spirit is the conclusion of the development of logic, nature, and spirit. So their advising is to inquire about the whole first, spirit being the whole. Inquire about the whole first, and then come to know the parts of the whole in relation to the whole. So this is now much broader application of the ideas discussed in this first chapter, the logic of life. But the idea is to have a rational system which allows us to deal with the whole and the parts in the whole, and how to come to know them in a very solid way, in a concrete way, which can deal with life and consciousness. Because what science has right now can't deal with life and consciousness in a proper way. So we may be conditioned to think that dealing with ideas of spirit is something very ambiguous and unscientific, but that's not the fact. When we come in contact with the proper individual who has undergone the proper process of coming to know these things and can communicate those things in a very effective way, like Sripad Bhaktimadhava Puri Maharaj has been able to do, along with those teachers that he has learned from, such as Srila Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Dev Goswami Maharaj, Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and the other Acharyas, and Hegel, and Aristotle, and Plato, and the systematic philosophies that have been developed there. When we start to think in terms of these, we apply them ourselves. We have to apply them ourselves, apply these modes of thinking ourselves, and see, does it give a better account of our experience, or does it leave us, in the dark? And we can judge how to move forward, based on our experience of applying these things and discussing these things, not just an individual effort, but we have to come and we have to discuss these things. And that's what we're trying to do here. So I really would like to just, emphasize, please ask questions. Try to be clear about the questions we're asking so we can have proper discussion about it. But, you have to just open up. If we're afraid to ask some question, just, don't be afraid. This is not a judgmental environment. We're trying to all make progress here together by the grace of the Lord. And, so please ask, and we'll try to discuss these things to the best of our ability.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Okay, you go ahead.
Devahuti Didi, please.
Prabhuji, I just was thinking the scientists who have given this abiogenesis topic, who believe in that, are they really do they really believe on that aspect, or it's just a sort of jargon? Sometimes people just keep using those jargons and they are not serious about it. They just come up with some jargons. Is it something like that, or do they really believe that abiogenesis aspects happens?
I'll let Google answer the question.
So many scientists are there, like Naomi. So many.
So
Wow, what a serious book that is.
Richard Dawkins is one of the main, in our modern world, is one of the main proponents of this kind of abiogenesis, Darwinian evolution thinking. And he directly uses this mode of thinking to publish books to a wide audience about topics like this, you can see. And he's a biologist, and there are also physicists. Now, Stephen Hawking, he's not in this world anymore, but he also did the same kind of thing. With his books. I don't think he named his book like that, but he would use the sales of his books to make those kind of points. Their ideas just are so random. It's all random material processes, and they definitely think that it's true. I can't speak about why they've embraced that, but yeah, people definitely they believe like that. But the important part to recognize is that it's just it's a belief. It's still on the level of belief, right? Because there's no you can't prove that there is no God. And even if you don't want to go to that level, we see the purpose. We speak about teleology because that's observable in nature. We see the purpose moving throughout nature. We can't have knowledge about nature without nature being consistent in some way. And that consistency is comprehensible to us, right? So the fact that we can comprehend those kind of consistent systems in nature, that means there's purpose there. We have the capacity to perceive that purpose and understand it. So the idea that there is no purpose, it's all just random, is very nonsensical. But anyhow, we try to take a more positive approach, though. We don't want to just dogmatically make statements because that's not going to help anybody. We want to try to take a more positive approach and show what is the reasonable the rational development of the more comprehensive ideas, and how that can give a better worldview, which is all encompassing of nature, encompassing of life and consciousness, and also encompassing of spirit.
Dawkins has a book called The Blind Watchmaker.
Yeah.
And wow, it's one different kind of a read. And the mere title of the book it's so clever in a way because it's animate and inanimate being spoken about. In other words, the watch is an inanimate object. The blind watchmaker has the potentiality to actualize the reality of a mechanical object, but nevertheless relies upon his consciousness to be able to actualize that from a conceptual point of view, but nevertheless, he's blind. So it's like a double contradiction in a sense. And it's a very clever argument in ways, and it's a very horrible book to read in so many other ways. But the whole idea that, just one idea that he would have is that he cannot answer the question as to why there is a living entity that has only one function in life, and that is to become a parasite that can only exist in the eyes of higher up creatures, so to speak. And that dependency on it, to try and understand and break down as to why certain chemical occurrences occur, and like where chemicals come together and they change their essential essence by the combination of this. However, they lack a soul, and just like the marble is restricted to the confines of its particular environment. So it reaches an obstacle, or you walk into a brick wall, you get a sudden sensation of reality. And these are real things, but nevertheless, without the consciousness of the living entity to experience this, and that goes to explain in so many different ways the holistic approach that must be taken in terms of interpreting our particular conceptual, sensual, social intercourse with the rest of the community, with the world, with the environment, with Gaia. And sorry, it's just that if the DNA, if the chemical components in a conscious entity are such that it gives its own individual manifestation as a physical body, but as you go up, well, that's so Darwinian, wrong to say, but as one goes to different levels of consciousness within different animals and species, when one reaches the human plateau, that the chemical reactions that occur within the brain would, how should I say, if for example, like you have, if DNA is responsible for the predisposition of any of the characteristics of that particular entity. So in other words, the potentiality to be a very antisocial individual, for example, brought about by environment and all the different circumstances, but the propensity has to exist within that particular individual, as it does with all individuals. But the Atma, or the soul, that is the, how should I say, it is that particular isolated yet part of the whole that oh, I'm getting kind of lost trying to express what I'm trying to say. But like if the DNA in the certain level of consciousness is responsible for our ability to be able to see things and conceptualize and then actualize, that
But we don't want to say that DNA is not responsible for consciousness, right? So DNA is matter. So matter never has a causal effect on consciousness, although it affects consciousness, sure, but it's not a causal, it doesn't cause consciousness. DNA inside the cell is like the instructions, it's like the blueprint. But we know that the blueprint can be there on a piece of paper. The blueprint is there in matter, but then you need the conscious entity that comes and reads the blueprint and then executes. So that's the cell. The cell is what comes and reads the DNA, essentially. There's a scientist here in the United States named James Shapiro, and he talks about the read-write genome. That it's not only that the cell reads the blueprint of DNA, but also the cell then can edit the DNA and write on it so that other cells can utilize it. So the main idea from what you're saying, though, is we don't want to confuse that DNA is causing consciousness, right? The conscious living entity comes and reads the matter, reads the instructions, but then it does its own thing based on its own purposes. You have to go. Yes.
This was wonderful. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I do have a meeting with someone at 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
And I totally loved this session and look forward to continuing next week and enjoy the rest of the discussion. I'll watch it on the replay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hare
Nice
Krishna.
to see you. Thank you for coming. Yes,
Mwah.
definitely.
Love you.
Love you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So yeah, Prabhu, that's one important thing that we should just remember about, that it's the living conscious entity, the cell, is coming to use the DNA, but the DNA is like the blueprint, kind of.
thank you, thank you.
Vishwambar Prabhu, we haven't seen or heard anything from you.
Nandas Prabhuji, Hare Krishna.
Can we see you?
Sure, Prabhuji. So background makes it very worse. Right? The background is good, but let me remove it. Yeah. So how is Puri Maharaj? How is his health?
He's okay, Prabhu. So what are you thinking of this, what we're doing here?
It's honestly speaking, I don't have that much qualification. Everything goes above my head, but some of it I catch it because in my student life, I did in fact read The Selfish Gene by the so-called Richard Dawkins.
Hmm.
So very, very convincing. At the same time, when I met devotees, I realized how rational his work is. So, only like my main realization has been that the Vedic knowledge is descending in nature. Like my Guru Parampara for that, it's descending in nature. Whereas scientific knowledge, it's in ascending. Yeah, there are two Sanskrit terms for that also, but yeah, that has been my realization. So absolute truth can only be revealed. There is no self endeavor for that. So no matter how much efforts we put uh, to understand the nature of the absolute truth and the nature of the self, it can only come through the grace of absolute truth, the Supreme Lord God Himself, or the Guru. So that is only minimal realization I have. But the entire discussion is really good, because it's a very proper synthesis of Eastern thought and Western thought. Um, I plan to buy Maharaj's book sometime soon. So let's see. Well, because right now I am not too much into books. It's better for me to just hear from Vani. Get the what is Shravanam. Do a lot of Shravanam and stick to that for the timing. So I'm not reading too many books also. So that's it from my side. But very good though. Presentation was really good, and I loved it.
Thank you, Prabhu. The next Sunday we're going to read the second chapter aloud. So you can come if you like and you can hear the reading.
Sure, bro. Sure. If my hands are not tied up anywhere, I'll definitely attend. It's a great pleasure all the time. Yeah.
Samangala Didi, Samangala Devidasi, Dhanavad Pranam.
Dandavat Pranam Prabhu, Dandavat Pranam Didi, Dandavat Pranam Didi.
Dandavat Pranam Didi, Dandavat. After long time.
Sorry, I was little busy in some services. That's why I couldn't connect with on time. Hare Krishna, Dandavat Pranam Prabhuji. Yes.
In the past, I think you have read this book. Sometimes you talk about it in the presentations during the conference.
Yeah.
Would you like to share any thoughts about it?
Yes, Prabhuji, this book is really wonderful. When I was collecting the articles for this book, and I feel yes, so many things and very much actually clear to me about the dose of mind and what we are actually thinking, and that is not the actual thing actually. And also there are so many things, but I think I have to understand this. Mean what the basic and fundamental things behind this actually thought of Sripad Puri Maharaj. That's why I want to actually know through him. Yeah.
Did you, so in professional, you're a scientist, but what science do you deal with mostly? Biology or chemistry?
What my subject?
Yeah.
My subject is chemistry.
Chemistry.
Yes.
So can I ask you, from your perspective, what is the biggest difference between chemical reactions you see in the natural environment outside of living entities versus the chemical reactions that are occurring within living entities? Can you say anything about that?
Yes. Actually, in chemical reaction, when we work in the laboratory, it should be under some external controlled environment. We have to put some external control situations, conditions like temperature, pressure, so many things we have to maintain externally, right? But in the case of inside, the chemical reactions are all chemical reactions are governed by the super soul, in the direction of super soul, because we never think that what we eat, if we eat a carbohydrate, we eat many things, many variety of chemicals, or you can say organic compounds, right? Like carbohydrate, vitamins, and many fats, and amino acids, etc. But we never think that how they will be digested. They are going to be digested, because these all things are going on simultaneously inside a living body. living system. But if we are going to do some chemical reaction in the laboratory, in the external environment, then we have to be very careful. And these are the difference actually that living entity living entity is a wonderful and creation of the supreme scientist.
Mm.
And I feel, yeah, this is the
Wow.
difference only.
Yeah, with respect to that, one more point I would like to add. However, it will graze the grass. Along with the grass, lot of sand and dirt also goes. But see the capability it has got. It will digest that and it will give us milk, isn't it? In spite of having a lot of impurity, you can do that. And when you're talking about the laboratories equipment can do only one type of processing. Maybe it can take grass and it can process that, and along with the grass, it will give
But
so
we have,
many other
yes,
aspects. It will, we can't get those sort of equipments at all to do the processing.
yeah, right, because it is externally controlled.
Yeah, it is highly impossible to think of those sort of processing devices, the laboratory. So it means it's very clear that it's highly impossible to compare a chemical reaction with what is happening in the biological body, living entity body, isn't it? Even though it's a chemical reaction, it is definitely not just mere chemical reaction. It is Pachana Kriya has been done by Lord Krishna. He says, no, Jatara Agni, I am Jatara Agni, he says.
In the book, Sripad Puri Maharaj, the distinguishing detail that he discusses is that the chemical reactions are not self-perpetuating. They'll go on and they'll have their reaction, but it won't go on for many years. But inside the living organism, so many chemical reactions are going on constantly for, in the human being for 75 years. And it's all being regulated internally, as you both are saying. But that's what makes it biological activity. It becomes something different than the mere chemical activity because it is taking place inside a whole, and it's happening for the sake of the whole through parts that are also for the sake of the whole, in addition to being for each other. So it's such an integrated system that the way that we approach it can't be through some kind of analytic understanding that always makes a distinction between things but doesn't see their unity. This is a point that Maharaj makes at the end of the book, and it may be a good way to start to conclude our discussion today. I just want to bring up that, I'm just going to read that one quote that Maharaj says. He says, yes, abstract, so we'll start. Life is a unity in multiplicity. It is a process as a united flow, but it consists of many instantiation or moments, like the frames of a movie. Abstract understanding tends to think of either a unity or a multiplicity. Pure multiplicity is indicative of the atomic thinking of material reductionism. Pure unity is the indeterminateness of abstract monism. Unity in multiplicity is the comprehensive thinking of dialectical reason. Life has to be comprehended as a process in which its participants are simultaneously both ends or products and means or production to one another. So it will become more easily seen why this is important in the discussion of the second chapter. But Maharaj here is making the distinction between two forms of consciousness. One is called the understanding, or in German is called Verstand, and then reason, which is in German called Vernunft. This is something that Immanuel Kant recognized, the distinction between the two, and then Hegel was able to develop the relevance of that distinction. So the understanding, the Verstand, it sees two things as different, and then it tries to know those differences as being opposed to one another. And this is the form of consciousness that is largely influenced modern scientific thinking. We see the differences between things, and we compare them, and we have vast bodies of knowledge of these different things, such that now we have biology, chemistry, and physics, which the biologists and physicists and chemists can barely have a dialogue with each other, because the body of knowledge in each of their distinct branches of science, they can't accommodate what the other branches are saying to a large extent. Sumangala Didi, can I ask you, do you find that experience where the chemists and biologists and physicists, they may be able to discuss with each other to some extent, but up to a certain point, they disagree on a lot from the different perspectives? Or do you think that's not correct, what I'm saying? You're on mute, Didi. We can't hear you.
Yeah, you are saying that physicists and chemicists and biologists can be maybe not agree on particular thing, right? May not
Yeah.
be agree, right? Because their perspective and is maybe changed, because they are thinking according to their consciousness, and whatever the depth of their development of their consciousness, they will only then they can go to that extent only, right? Physicists can think only uh, uh, in the domain of his physics and physical laws, like and likewise chemists can only think about their domain, right? But and biologists in the same way. But if the the core of these three peoples, or these three different kind of person, physicist, chemist, or like a biologist, if their consciousness, or we can say their soul is actually, I mean, the nature of soul is, I mean, we is only according to Srimad Bhagavad Gita, the nature of soul is Satyachit Anand Swarup, right? But if they will feel or realize the extent of this kind of things, Satyachit Anand Swarup, and if they will work uh, on particular in this field, or if they understand the science of the soul, then only these three, this different, these three different fields can be accommodated on single point if they know the science of the soul. This may be the only point they can be unite, or they can be agree on particular thought. Otherwise, there is some laws in physics or in chemistry that is on, can be explained on the same basis, but on the you can say broader aspect or the higher level, they cannot understand the things until they understand the science of the soul, and they elevate their consciousness accordingly.
Hmm. Yeah. So this is a perfect example of what Maharaj is saying here, how because current science is characterized by the form of consciousness called Verstand, or understanding, they are only seeing the differences. The laws that they've conceived are only based on the differences on the different scales of reality. The physical physics is dealing with the microscopic, and biologists are dealing with more macroscopic, and chemicals are kind of in between. But this is only seeing the differences. And so Maharaj is saying here that if they can utilize the form of consciousness called reason, or Vernunft, as described by both Kant and Hegel, that the character of that form of consciousness is seeing the unity. How are the phenomena of physics, chemistry, and biology unified? And what Dr. Sumangala is saying is very nice. The science of the soul, if they can understand the science of the soul, then they'll be able to see the unity in those different fields of study. And we want, that is definitely what we are agreeing with, but we just are trying to take a scientific approach to this and not just say soul without developing by necessity what is meant by that and how it's directly related to the phenomena that we're observing. And that's what Hegel gives, actually. Hegel gives the development from logic to nature to spirit. Means logic means what are the fundamental thought determinations which are present in pure thought, which means not sensuous, and also sensuous thought, what we are observing in nature. What are those underlying thought determinations and how do they develop out of each other to go through logic from being to non-being to becoming, from being to essence to concept and so forth, into nature, through nature, into the human form of life, and through the human form of life into the realization of spirit as being an organic whole or the absolute. But what is the scientific process involved in coming to know them without dogmatically just asserting this or that? That is what Hegel has given in a very systematic way, and that is what we are reading about throughout this book is the details of that system and its relevance to science, how to know the unity in difference of nature. Physics, chemistry, and biology, they are all observing the same thing in different ways. So their knowledge shouldn't just be opposed to each other. There may be some difference, of course, but the unity is also there. And without perceiving that unity, the knowledge they have is incomplete. So we need to know how to take a conceptual approach to studying these things so that we see the unity in multiplicity, this dialectic idea. And through this book, Idols of the Mind versus True Reality, it is given, this is the introduction to these ideas and their relevance to nature and then the higher development of spirit. So we're very happy that we have a group of sincere seekers here trying to come to know this better so that we can engage more consciously in our reality that we're living day to day, so we can learn how to think in a very comprehensive, holistic way, and we can go about our different duties and services in a very nice way under the guidance of those personalities who are qualified to give us this kind of knowledge and to instruct us in a way that allows us to realize these things for ourselves, so that it's not some dogmatic, blind faith, but it's reason. The development of reason is very nice. So I just, before we conclude, are there any final comments or questions from any of the participants? No, if not, then we'll conclude. We'll give our honor to the assembled Vaishnavas, Vanchakalpa, Tribhascha, Kripasindu, Bhyevacha, Patitanam, Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo Namaha. Our spiritual masters, our teachers, our spiritual preceptors. Omikana Timirin Hasya Gyananjana Salakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurve Namah. Jai.
Aye.
Dandava Pranam. Pranam Prabhu Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Dhanavad.